There we go. Hopefully you can see those.
Yep, that's
Um,
working.
Great. The title of my talk is Sir Humphry Davy: His Life, Letters, and Notebooks. It'll last around an hour, I think, and then we'll have time at the end for discussion and questions. Okay, so here we go. When we call to mind Sir Humphry Davy, if indeed we ever call him to mind, perhaps the first thing that we think about is the miner's safety lamp that bears his name, the Davy lamp, and there is an example. In 2015, the bicentenary of the invention of Davy's safety lamp was celebrated. Well, perhaps celebrated is too strong a word. The occasion was marked only modestly with the publication of a new coffee table book on the various safety lamps that were invented circa 1815, Davy's included. To a Victorian or even an early 20th century audience, the idea of Davy slipping so far out of view, tumbling so far down in our collective consciousness, would be truly extraordinary. He was, we might say, one of the foremost celebrities of his age, the boy from the Celtic fringe of Cornwall who rose spectacularly through hard work and unwavering determination to the pinnacle of the presidency of the Royal Society in 1820, becoming a knight and then a baronet along the way. But slipped indeed Davy has. The reasons for this are many and complex, but here's one. In this country, we've come to think of arts and sciences as being somehow separate. Perhaps at school you were good at both, but felt compelled, or indeed were compelled, to pursue one course of study over the other. When C.P. Snow wrote of there being two cultures in 1959, the opposing, quote, polar groups who had almost ceased to communicate at all and had so little in common, that had already been established for several decades, as Snow acknowledges. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, such a notion of arts and sciences as being fundamentally different, as being without communication and commonality, would have been viewed with some suspicion. The word scientist wasn't coined until 1833, 4 years after Davy's death. And when Davy was carrying out his most important chemical work, scientific specialism was still in its infancy. Of the spirit of intellectual inquiry in Davy's age, Davy perhaps says it best in verse in one of his notebooks, used circa 1812. Here is an image of the verse fragment. That is Davy's handwriting. And here, thankfully, is a transcription. I'll just read this out. O most magnificent and noble nature, have I not worshipped thee with such a love as never mortal man before displayed, adored thee in thy majesty of visible creation, and searched into thy hidden and mysterious ways as poet, as philosopher, as sage. Searched into thy hidden and mysterious ways as poet, as philosopher, as sage. You might glean from this that Davy had a very high opinion of himself. Indeed, it's true, he did. But leaving that to one side for now, the significance of Davy's speaker of the poem, searching into the hidden and mysterious ways of nature as an inquirer, or inquiring mind made up of several parts, poet, philosopher, sage, cannot be overstated. Davy was a poet, he was a philosopher. We might even admit that he was entitled later in life to think of himself as a sage. His accomplishments, such as isolating more chemical elements than anyone had done before or has done since, carrying undeniable weight. Yet, in the age of specialization, the idea of the one culture, in quotes, intellectual, one who could range confidently across chemistry, poetry, philosophy, geology, medicine, and more, has become rather unfashionable. Hence, figures such as Davy often seem like curious outliers today. In today's talk, using a range of sources, including Davy's letters, most only recently published, and notebooks, most of which are currently unpublished, we'll explore some of what I think are the lesser-known aspects of Davy's extraordinary life, career, and works. And I hope that the portrait of Davy that emerges as we look more closely at 4 key periods of his life, at least begins to bring home the point that, as his contemporaries were well aware, there was and is much more to Davy than the lamp. In Davy's time, as I intend to show, it was possible to make striking, original intellectual contributions on several fronts, which indeed he did. So first, let's turn to Davy's early years to better understand where it all began. As Davy's biographer, David Knight, observes, the Cornwall of Davy's childhood was both rural and industrialised. Davy was born in 1778, by which time the so-called Industrial Revolution was well underway in Britain. Cornwall, remote from the metropolis, was a land of myths and coves, folklore and moors, but also of steam engines and mines, specifically tin mines. Underground tin mining had been a staple of Cornish industry since at least the 16th century. The arrival of engines such as Matthew Boulton and James Watt's increased output significantly. Cornwall was the native place of Richard Trevithick, whose Puffing Devil, which we can see there, successfully transported 6 passengers through Camborne on Christmas Eve in 1801, one of the earliest examples of passenger steam locomotive use in Britain. Davy's father, Robert, was a poor woodcarver. He invested unwisely in local mining ventures and died indebted in 1794, leaving the 15-year-old Davy, his eldest son, in a position of heavy responsibility. Davy's mother, Grace, was a milliner. She had already, before Robert's death, enlisted the help of John Tonkin, a local apothecary and surgeon, and a friend of the Davy family, to ensure the continuity of Davy's schooling. Tonkin was, in effect, a surrogate father to Davy. He allowed Davy to live at his house, where, according to an anecdote, Davy delighted and probably terrified his sister Kitty by producing homemade fireworks. And he paid for Davy's attendance at Truro Grammar School, where it's fair to say he was a middling pupil. But Davy's education was by no means limited to the classroom. In a notebook used circa 1795, shortly after leaving Truro, Davy set out a daunting plan for the continuation of his learning. I won't read all of this out, and you probably can't make much of this out, but we can see that Davy has identified 9 main areas of study, including theology, logic, language, physics, and crucially, there is an entry for my profession next to the number 3 there, which is to take in botany, pharmacy, nosology, the classification of diseases, anatomy, surgery, and chemistry. Already at an early point, we're gaining a sense of the young Davy's many interests and of the ambitious self-determination that was to become a hallmark of his life and career. The first step on the path of Davy's career was an apprenticeship with John Bingham Boles, an apothecary surgeon of Penzance. Looking back, we can see that Davy's fledgling career as a Cornish apothecary was effectively derailed by a series of chance meetings. Firstly, he met Thomas Wedgwood, son of Josiah Wedgwood of the Wedgwood pottery firm, who travelled to Cornwall for the milder winter to aid his recovery from tuberculosis. Secondly, Gregory Watt, son of James Watt of steam engine fame, came to Cornwall for the winter of 1797-8, also to recuperate from TB, and he lodged with the Davy family. Watt and Davy, both young men full of intellectual curiosity and grand plans, soon hit things off. In meeting Wedgwood and Watt, both young men with scientific interests and family connections to the Lunar Society of Birmingham, Davy was pulled a little further out of Boles's orbit, away from his apprenticeship. Perhaps the most crucial acquaintance that Davy made during the early years of his apprenticeship was with Davy's Giddy, a local patron with mathematical and scientific interests. As Knight recounts, Giddy met the uncouth young Davy swinging on Boles's gate, and being told of his interests, exclaimed, "Chemical experiments? If that be the case, I must have some conversation with him." Not only did Giddy and Davy converse, but the Oxford graduate Giddy gave Davy access to his personal library. Giddy was a man with connections. At Oxford, he had attended the chemical lectures of Dr. Thomas Beddoes, whom Richard Lovell Edgeworth, another member of the Lunar Society, described as a little fat Democrat of considerable abilities, of great name in the scientific world as a naturalist and chemist. Beddoes was Jacobin in sympathies, a dangerous political position to occupy in the 1790s, when memories of the French Revolution and the following reign of terror were still fresh. And Edgeworth was cognizant of the danger, writing, "If he, Beddoes, bloweth the trumpet of sedition, the aristocracy will rather go to hell with Satan than with any democratic devil." Beddoes came to Cornwall in early 1798 to examine minerals. Through the efforts of Giddy and Gregory Watt, he received an essay by Davy in April of that year, entitled "An Essay on Heat, Light, and the Combinations of Light." Beddoes was impressed and published Davy's essay in his 1799 volume, Contributions to Physical and Medical Knowledge, principally from the West of England. This was Davy's first scientific publication, and it became a source of embarrassment to him in later years, with Davy dismissing it as little more than his infant chemical speculations. But Beddoes gave the precocious young Davy, 19 years of age at the time of writing his essay, more than his first scientific publication. He also offered him a job. In 1794, Beddoes, having quarrelled with his employers in Oxford over his political sympathies, had founded the Medical Pneumatic Institution in the Hotwells area of Bristol, near Clifton. Hotwells had long been known as a place to take the waters for health benefits. The treatments Beddoes offered were rather different, however. At the Medical Pneumatic Institution, which I'll refer to as the MPI from now on, Beddoes promoted the inhalation of gases for therapeutic purposes. The MPI was part infirmary and part research centre. Many of Beddoes' treatments, which he employed in attempts to cure tuberculosis, asthma, cancer, and more, were decidedly experimental. By 1798, the year of his trip to Cornwall, Beddoes needed an assistant at the MPI. Who better to employ than the talented young experimentalist his friend Giddy had brought to his attention? With Giddy's help and at Beddoes' bidding, Davy negotiated his release from his apprenticeship with Borlase. Tonkin, Davy's guardian, was, as we might expect, perturbed. Davy was, as Knight notes, being tempted away into what seemed a madcap scheme, pneumatic medicine looking very much like quackery, just when he seemed to be on the threshold of a useful career as a medical man in Penzance. And not only this, Davy was getting into bed with a political radical. Setting out from Penzance on the 2nd of October 1798, the young Davy was perhaps a little anxious, but more than a little excited as well about the new life that lay before him in Bristol. At the MPI, Davy's primary focus was on nitrous oxide, the gas that is popularly known today as laughing gas. In 1796, the New York chemist Samuel Latham Mitchell published an essay, Remarks on the Gaseous Oxide of Azote, or of Nitrogen, in which he argued that nitrous oxide was, quote, the oxide of septon, the poisonous cause of infection in living things. Of the effects of nitrous oxide on people, synthesized some 25 years previously by Joseph Priestley, Mitchell warns, when applied to a living body, it produces violent inflammation and ulceration of the fingers or hand which come into contact with it. Drawn into the nostrils, it excites alarming tumefaction with heat and pain. If inspired fully into the lungs, it brings on instant death. Quite dramatic stuff. Davy, always one to try things out for himself, was not convinced by Mitchell's claim. Having firstly tested the effects of nitrous oxide on a variety of plants and animals, Davy decided to do what Mitchell had so sternly cautioned against. He fully breathed the gas into his lungs. This gives us something of the measure of the man. Davy wasn't one for health and safety, and he often put himself and others at risk in the name of science. On one occasion at the MPI, he decided to inhale a large quantity of carbon monoxide, again in the name of science, with near fatal effects, as we might expect. The effects of inhaling nitrous oxide were, however, rather different. As detailed in his first book, Researches, Chemical and Philosophical, chiefly concerning nitrous oxide or dephlogisticated nitrous air and its respiration, which was published in 1800, Davy began by breathing a weak mixture of nitrous oxide and atmospheric air. And this is Davy's account of that. The first inspirations occasioned a slight degree of giddiness. This was succeeded by an uncommon sense of fullness in the head, accompanied with loss of distinct sensation and voluntary power, a feeling analogous to that produced in the first stage of intoxication. Davy then upped the dose, breathing purer gas this time. I breathed 4 quarts of nitrous oxide from and into a silk bag. The first feelings were similar to those produced in the last experiment. The respiration being continued, these feelings were succeeded by a sensation analogous to gentle pressure on all the muscles, attended by a highly pleasurable thrilling, particularly in the chest and the extremities. The objects around me became dazzling and my hearing more acute. Davy then upped the dose again, 6 to 7 quarts now. Generally, when I breathed from 6 to 7 quarts, muscular motions were produced to a certain extent. Sometimes I manifested my pleasure by stamping or laughing only. At other times, by dancing round the room and vociferating. There's some great stuff in Researches, lots of witness statements, accounts of engaging with this new wonder-working gas, as one of the inhalers called it. Finally, Davy did away with the silk breathing bag altogether and upgraded his hardware significantly. This is a quote. On December the 26th, I was enclosed in an airtight breathing box of the capacity of about 9.5 cubic feet. 20 quarts of nitrous oxide were added, then 20 quarts more, then 20 quarts more. After an hour and a quarter, Davy emerged, probably unsteadily, from the box and apparently took up the breathing bag again. The moment after, I began to respire 20 quarts of unmingled, i.e. pure nitrous oxide. A thrilling extending from the chest to the extremities was immediately produced. I felt a sense of tangible extension, highly pleasurable in every limb. My visible impressions were dazzling and apparently magnified. I heard distinctly every sound in the room and was perfectly aware of my situation. By degrees, as the pleasurable sensations increased, I lost all connection with external things. Trains of vivid, visible images rapidly passed through my mind and were connected with words in such a manner as to produce perceptions perfectly novel. I existed in a world of newly connected and newly modified ideas. With the most intense belief and prophetic manner, I exclaimed to Dr. Kinglake, one of Davy's colleagues, "Nothing exists but thoughts. The universe is composed of impressions, ideas, pleasures, and pains." Davy also wrote poetry under the influence of nitrous oxide, as in this example, imaginatively called On Breathing the Nitrous Oxide, from a notebook used in 1801. And here is the poem. Not in the, not in the ideal dreams of wild desire have I beheld a rapture wakening form. My bosom burns with no unhallowed fire, yet is my cheek with rosy blushes warm. Yet are my eyes with sparkling lustre filled, yet is my mouth implete with murmuring sound. Yet are my limbs with inward transports thrilled, and clad with newborn mightiness around. We can see in this example that Davy experimented with changing the word murmuring to dying and then going back to murmuring. this is one of the challenges of working with the notebooks. They are very much working documents, and Davy would occasionally go back and revise his earlier work. But in this example, he did settle on the word murmuring. In a notebook dating from 1799, which was a peak inhalation year for Davy, he writes in inch-high letters, Davy and Newton. Intense belief and prophetic manner indeed. Did the 20-year-old Davy, probably under the influence of nitrous oxide, have an inkling that he would attain the office of President of the Royal Society some 20 years later, as his idol Isaac Newton had in the preceding century? Newton was always a great hero of Davy's. As I've said, Davy's book Researches also contains witness statements from other inhalers invited to the MPI to try the gas, including Robert Southey, later poet laureate, who says, "The laugh was involuntary but highly pleasurable, accompanied by a thrill all through me." Another inhaler was Peter Mark Roget of Roget's Thesaurus fame, who recounted, "I suddenly lost sight of all the objects around me, they being apparently obscured by clouds." And the very enthusiastic inhaler, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, noted that, "I could not avoid beating the ground with my feet." That Davy and his circle were breathing nitrous oxide for aesthetic rather than anesthetic purposes is plain. In fact, the suggestion that nitrous oxide might have a medical application is made only very slightly on only one occasion in Davy's almost 600-page book. Davy writes, "The power of the immediate operation of the gas in removing intense physical pain, I had a very good opportunity for ascertaining." That's it. This opportunity was the pain Davy was experiencing as the result of an erupting wisdom tooth. And it would be several decades until nitrous oxide was used in a dental or medical context. By the second half of 1800, Davy was becoming disillusioned with the promises of Beddoes' pneumatic medicine. Few of the therapies offered at the MPI had any real effect on remedying the maladies they were intended to treat. Besides, the directions of Davy's researches were gradually beginning to turn elsewhere. He'd recently heard reports of a new device that had been invented by the Italian man of science, Alessandro Volta. This was the voltaic pile, which was in effect the first electric battery. By August 1800, Davy had access to a voltaic pile through Beddoes, and he was enthusiastically making attempts to decompose water by electrolysis, effectively using the pile to break down water into its constituent elements. And Davy was by no means alone in this line of research. A decade later, in an 1810 lecture, he recalled that the voltaic battery was as an alarm bell to experimenters in every part of Europe. Yet, as superintendent of the MPI, Davy was still having to deal with a steady stream of so-called gas wonder hunters who came through the door looking for marvelous cures to their various ailments. And Beddoes was now also pushing him to establish a course of treatment for syphilis, again using gases. Whether Davy was actively looking for a new post in the second half of 1800, a post in which he could more freely pursue his new and exciting researches in electrochemistry, is unclear. Davy's letter to his mother of the 27th of September 1800, however, suggests that negotiations regarding a move were already afoot. This is Davy writing to his mother. This letter was previously unpublished until recently. "My future prospects are of a very brilliant nature, and they are become more brilliant since I last wrote to you. But wherever there is uncertainty, I shall refrain from anticipating." So that's the early Davy and his time at the Medical Pneumatic Institution. The 22-year-old Davy arrived in London on the 11th of March, 1801. On the back of several strong recommendations, he had, quite extraordinarily considering his relative inexperience, been appointed assistant lecturer in chemistry at the newly founded Royal Institution on Albemarle Street in Mayfair. The mission of the Royal Institution, or RI for short, was set down in its prospectus as for diffusing the knowledge and facilitating the general introduction of useful mechanical inventions and improvements, and for teaching, by courses of philosophical lectures and experiments, the application of science to the common purposes of life. The emphasis on diffusing knowledge and teaching was there from the very beginning, and that was to be a key strand of Davy's new role. Of course, there was plenty of time, and as the RI had wealthy backers, the facilities for high-level research. Communicating the latest scientific discoveries was equally as important, though. So science communication was key to the mission of the RI, as indeed it still is. You might have seen the Christmas lectures this year, Professor Sue Black. When Davy first arrived in London, there was some initial consternation as to his suitability for the lecturing role he had been recommended for, as an only recently published biographical account, probably written by Davy's friend Thomas Richard Underwood, explains. The managers of the Royal Institution were struck most unfavourably with Davy's infantine face, natural awkwardness, and Cornish accent. All Davy's friends who had recommended him for the role could obtain was that he should deliver a lecture on galvanism, electrochemistry effectively, in a comparatively small room on the ground floor of the Royal Institution. This room, by the exertions of the party, was crowded to suffocation and graced by the presence of many of the youthful females of that party, and among them several of the highest rank in the country. They were captivated by his pretty face, simplicity of manner, and most romantic poetical language. While the men were struck with the novelty of the subject, it being the first lecture on galvanism ever given in London, and of which he evinced himself completely master. Davy's lectures were attended by a real range of people, female, male, all different ages. We know that young Mary Shelley, went to one of Davy's lectures. There is an argument that some of the narrative of Frankenstein is based on what Mary Shelley learned from Davy. She was an enthusiastic reader of his published works as well. The manager's early doubts quickly evaporated, as Underwood confirms. Davy's success was such that he was instantly engaged at a higher salary than his friends had demanded, and desired to repeat the lecture the next day. From that moment, he became the most popular lecturer ever heard in London. This is no overstatement from Underwood. Davy's lectures were very big occasions indeed. Albemarle Street, the site of the RI, was made the first one-way street in London as a direct result of the street becoming clogged with carriage traffic on the days of Davy's lectures. In his letters, Davy records that he was very much flattered to find the theatre overflowing in January 1802, and he candidly observes in June of the same year that my labours in the theatre of the Royal Institution have been more successful than I could have hoped. The early years of the 19th century were, by any measure, golden ones for Davy. His mind teemed with new ideas, theories, and experiments, intermixed with the new impressions of what he called the great hotbed of human power of the capital. And he relished all of the new experiences that had opened up to him as a rising star in the metropolis. Alongside his lectures, Davy carried on his researches in electrochemistry, feeling much less hampered by trivial or unpromising business than he had done at the MPI. Writing to his friend John King on the 22nd of June 1801, Davy observed that I am about 1,000,000 times as much a being of my own volition as at Bristol. Davy now had the time and the means to direct his own course of research, and the results were astonishing. I'm skipping forward a few years now to 1807. Since arriving at the RI, the bulk of Davy's research time had been focused on the still burgeoning field of electrochemistry, and Davy had been hard at work using the voltaic pile, to break down complex substances into simpler ones. The Royal Institution's battery was among the largest and most powerful anywhere. Indeed, Davy was keen to ensure that his pile, the one in London, was larger than any pile in Paris, Britain having been at war with France since 1803. In late October 1807, Davy, now a fellow of the Royal Society and professor of chemistry at the RI, wrote a letter to his sister Elizabeth containing a rather throwaway comment. Davy writes, I have been constantly occupied for the last 6 weeks in some important experiments which have led to very important results, and my labours are fully rewarded by happy discoveries. What Davy was actually announcing here was that he had successfully used the electrochemical methods he'd been developing over the past 7 years to isolate for the first time the chemical element that he soon after named potassium. We've learned from working on the notebooks that Davy's researches into potassium and sodium in particular were very intense. We've learned new facts. He went through, he played around with the idea of calling potassium potassium. This is something we didn't know. Sodium sodacium. Obviously, those terms didn't stick. He also toyed with calling them potagen and sodagen, but we didn't know this until we worked on the notebooks. But of course, he stuck with potassium. Soon after, he isolated sodium, again for the first time. And as Davy was learning more from his work on potassium and sodium, and growing more confident in his methods, soon after that followed magnesium, calcium, strontium, and barium. As I said in my introduction, no one person had isolated as many chemical elements as this before, and no one person has since. The 29-year-old Davy had isolated 6 elements, and others, boron, chlorine, iodine, using slightly different methods, followed. He announced his work in lectures to the Royal Society, where it was eagerly read in Britain, Europe, and beyond. I'll do that again. He announced his work in lectures to the Royal Society and published it in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, where it was eagerly read in Britain, Europe, and beyond. It was this work, Davy's work in the Transactions and his lectures, which transformed contemporary understandings of chemistry. And this effectively made Davy's name as the foremost man of science in Britain in the first decade of the 19th century. I've got a notebook there up on screen. We're working on Davy's full notebook collection. There are around 75 of them in all. Most are held at the Royal Institution. Some are held in Crescent-Kerno in Cornwall, Davy's native place. And the notebooks themselves there is a real range of material in there, and physically they are quite different. So this is a very large notebook, a large laboratory notebook, notebook 06. And this was kept at the RI during the period of Davy's most important chemical researches. As we'd expect, there's lots of experimental detail in the laboratory notebooks specifically, but I'd also like to suggest that some of the entries in the notebooks, the lab notebooks, are revealing of Davy's character. The lab notebooks are fascinating records of the work that was done in the laboratory, containing experimental detail like this, much of it dated, diary-like. We can see soda decomposed with different phenomena, October the 20th. We also have sketches of chemical apparatus. I have no idea what that is. there are lots of these throughout the lab notebooks. Also, lots of working calculations, which cause us a real headache when we're transcribing and trying to represent what Davy wrote on screen. It's not straightforward. We also have lists of apparatus and chemicals needed and purchased, and some other lists. These were shared documents, the notebooks, so whoever was working on that particular day would record what they'd done. We have lots in Davy's hand. We also have the hands of his assistants. His brother John worked for a while as Davy's assistant, and we also have some unknown hands. So people were clearly working with Davy in the lab, but it's a case of trying to match up examples of their handwriting with letters or verifiable other examples of writing, and it's not straightforward. In one lab notebook entry, Davy, breaking off from recording experimental detail for a moment, sets out a short list of regulations for his young lab assistants, one of whom would later include a certain Michael Faraday to adhere to. So this is Davy. Some regulations with regard to the state of the laboratory. Number 1, everything is to be put in its proper place in the evening and every time to be arranged for the next day's operations. Number 2, the fire to be lighted at 8 o'clock and the apparatus for the experiments prepared by 9. Although this might seem rather mundane stuff, it sheds light on Davy, the professional experimentalist. He's meticulous, assertive, perhaps even a little domineering. Later, in another laboratory notebook, we see Davy in a similar, perhaps even more high-handed mode. So this is from another large lab notebook, notebook 7. No experiments are to be made or carried on in the laboratory without the consent and approbation of the professor of chemistry, that being Davy. The attempt at original experiments, unless preceded by knowledge, with a capital K underlined, merely interferes with the progress of discovery. This entry speaks of how Davy viewed himself in a professional context, as a maker and enforcer of rules, as a director of research, and indeed as a director of discovery itself, and of how he projected himself to those he considered his intellectual inferiors. We might be detecting a burgeoning arrogance in Davy here. Arrogance and irascibility were accusations increasingly levelled at Davy as he grew older. We shouldn't forget, however, just how stratospheric Davy's rise had been in the first decade of the 1800s. He'd gone in a relatively short space of time from humble apprentice in a remote part of the country to lionized lecturer in the capital, and director of one of the most significant research laboratories in Europe to boot. Perhaps we can therefore understand, if not necessarily condone, the arrogance of which the established, in inverted commas, Davy is frequently accused. Let's now skip forward a few years to 1815, when Davy was effectively retired from the RI, married to a wealthy heiress, Jane Priest, and in recognition of his chemical work, that work on electrochemistry at the Royal Institution, now a knight, he'd been knighted, to see whether such accusations of arrogance were fair. In my introduction, I said that one of my aims today is to show that there was and is much more to Davy than the lamp. We can't run through Davy's life and career in the way that we are doing without discussing his work on the safety lamp at least a little, however. In this portrait, we have Davy seated at a desk. We can see in the right of the picture the lamp. Davy, in several of Davy's portraits, there will be a lamp somewhere. You know, it represents the pinnacle of his achievement, at least in the popular consciousness. As part of the team that recently edited Davy's letters, we've discovered many new details relating to Davy's invention of his miner's safety lamp. I'm being very careful here. I say his lamp rather than the lamp, as there were several different competing designs of safety lamp produced in the second decade of the 1800s. The dispute over who should be recognized as having invented the safety lamp, which is perhaps something of a fool's errand, was acrimonious, carried on in public meetings and in the newspapers in London and the northeast of England, the foremost coal-producing region in Britain at the time. But first, some historical context. In August 1815, Davy was enlisted by Robert Gray, rector of Bishop Wearmouth near Sunderland, and an influential member of the Society for the Prevention of Accidents in Coal Mines, which was also called the Sunderland Society, to come up with a practical solution to the continuing menace of fire damp explosions in mines. Fire damp is a naturally occurring, highly flammable mixture of gases that explodes when exposed to a naked flame, and which in the first years of the 19th century had caused several horrific mining disasters below ground, such as that at Felling Colliery on the 25th of May 1812, when 92 miners were killed. There are some horrific contemporary accounts of this. I might be able to say a little bit more about that at the end if there's interest. So Davy, having visited mines in the northeast, thought that a lamp that would burn fire damp in a controlled way was the solution. Up until this point, miners had generally used naked flames below ground. When their candle flames came into contact with a pocket of fire damp, a powerful explosion resulted, with often fatal consequences. And these accidents were going on all of the time. The one at Felling was one of the worst, however. Davy set to work in the basement laboratory of the Royal Institution in early October 1815, having samples of fire damp sent down from the northeast, from mines to London in wine bottles. By the end of the month, he was writing to Robert Gray, as well as the Reverend John Hodgson, who is mentioned on the blue plaque there, another member of the Sunderland Society, with descriptions of 4 prototypes of lamp. None of these 4 prototypes was the lamp for which Davy became truly famous. That lamp, which made use of wire gauze for its principle of safety, we've already seen this image, came shortly afterwards in mid to late December of that year, which speaks, I think, of the intensity and the rapid rate of development of his work in the latter months of 1815. Davy was working so intensively on this with Faraday that by the time papers he had sent off for publication appeared, they were already out of date. So this caused a lot of confusion and misunderstanding, which in part is why the debate over who should have priority for invention of the lamp was so muddy. The field was very rapidly changing and shifting. I've mentioned a little bit of the controversy. By the 5th of December 1815, Davy had been publicly accused in a letter published in the Newcastle paper, the Tyne Mercury, of having, in inverted commas, borrowed elements of an early safety lamp designed by William Reed Clanny. a Sunderland-based physician who had published a description of his rather unwieldy invention in 1815. The lamp that Clanny's holding there was not the lamp that he described in 1813. That lamp required two men to operate. One would have the lamp kind of on their body, kind of a reverse backpack type thing, and the other one would be operating a system of bellows. So this is how the lamp that Clanny's holding is how it ended up, but the original was a rather different machine. Later, in early 1816, supporters of George Stephenson would also claim that their man should be recognised as the inventor of the safety lamp, as Stephenson had tested an early version of his own design below ground in late October 1815, which was more than 2 months before any lamp of Davy's was taken into a working mine. Claim and counterclaim issued from each opposing camp. There was a regional aspect to the debate as well. Davy was, as we'll see in a moment, rather dismissive of the northeastern engineering community. They were not men of science. They were not in the southeast. They were not metropolitan. A sensational terms such as plagiarism, piracy, and libel were aired, and ill feeling grew on both sides. The now generally accepted explanation of events, that Davy and Stephenson had both invented similar lamps at the same time, was barely countenanced. Like notebooks, private letters, by that I mean those not intended to be published, can be very revealing. I'll now return to the question of Davy's growing arrogance by examining several letters, only recently published, in which he refers to Stephenson and his lamp. At first, Davy refers to Stephenson rather coolly as some sort of unknown quantity, as in his letter to John George Lambton of the 29th of October, 1816. This is Davy writing in a private capacity. I never heard a word of George Stephenson and his lamps till 6 weeks after my principle of security had been published. And the general impression of the scientific men in London, which is confirmed by what I heard at Newcastle, was that Stephenson had some loose idea floating in his mind, which he had unsuccessfully attempted to put in practice till after my labours were made known. By the 8th of February 1817, so just a few months later, Davy was beginning to make personal attacks on Stephenson, a man he'd never met and never did meet, as in this letter to John Hodgson. Depend upon it, Stephenson is not a man whose testimony is worth anything. The persons who have read his pamphlet here vote him a thief and not a clever thief. The pamphlet being referred to is just a very, very short factual statement issued by Stephenson, just detailing the design of his latest lamp. In a letter to the mining engineer, John Buddle, 5 days later, Davy becomes more hostile. I wish Stephenson and his attempts had been always greeted with silent contempt. Give a knave rope sufficient and he will hang himself, and he has, I think, effectually done so in his miserable, pilfering, lying, and equivocating pamphlet. By the time of his 11th of December 1817 letter to Hodgson, Davy is indignant and ranting. I have been used extremely ill by many of the persons in the highest class in your neighbourhood. That would be near Gateshead in the northeast. They have entirely forgotten my situation in society, the capital S. They have offered me an indignity in making an ignorant mechanic my philosophical rival, but they cannot affect my fame. Davy uses the word ignorance in relation to Stephenson several times, and in another letter even goes so far as to brand Stephenson an illiterate pirate. This all happens over the space of little over a year in which Davy, on the evidence of his letters, appears to have come close to something approximating a nervous breakdown. Davy was, remember, now part of the scientific and metropolitan elite, with easy access to the finest scientific minds and equipment in the country. Stevenson was a mining mechanic from Killingworth who was simply attempting to put his skills to use to mitigate the devastating effects of disasters at his place of work. The disproportionate nature of Davy's reaction to Stevenson is very telling. Even after Davy had been made a baronet, in recognition of his safety lamp work, he still railed against his philosophical rival in letters and other writings, such as the poem he drafted in one of his notebooks with the catchy title, "Thought after the ingratitude of the Northumbrians with respect to the safety lamp." Davy never patented his lamp, considering it a gift to the nation, thus projecting his safety lamp researches as a noble endeavour. And indeed, this remains the popular narrative, that Davy's work was noble and heroic. As his private letters reveal, however, the truth was far less palatable. As the safety lamp controversy demonstrates, public image and private reality, if you like, as revealed in letters and notebooks, can at times be dramatically at odds. On the topic of Davy supposedly leaving his lamp for the nation by not patenting it, it would have been extremely difficult for Davy to actually secure a patent, simply because there was such debate about who had invented what, and very quickly the lamps became kind of hybridized, and there were borrowings of all kinds going on. So I think he would have actually struggled to patent it if he had wanted to. I'm just looking at the time. Okay, so we'll now look a little at Davy's later years. Following the death of Sir Joseph Banks, Davy was elected president of the Royal Society in 1820, the most prestigious office for a man of science in Britain. His presidency, however, was not a happy nor a particularly successful one. In 1823, Davy was approached by the Navy Board to come up with a chemical solution to the erosion of copper-bottomed ships' hulls by seawater. The Navy Board were hoping for a triumph of applied science, similar to what Davy had accomplished with his safety lamp researches in the previous decade. Davy thought electrochemical protection was the answer, attaching sacrificial strips of metal more reactive than copper to the hull, thus protecting the copper. Davy's protectors, as they came to be known, were beset by an unforeseen problem, however. Many of the ships that had them fitted quickly became fouled underneath by weeds, barnacles, and other sea creatures. The decay of the copper had previously produced poisonous salts that prevented this happening, as the weeds and creatures were unable to thrive in the presence of the salts. Now, without those salts, the marine life around and on the vessels thrived, making the ships covered with a mass of living things almost impossible to steer. By 1825, the Admiralty had ordered the Navy Board to stop installing Davy's protectors and to remove all previously installed protectors from their ships. This was, fair to say, a public humiliation for Davy, who had failed to come up with the solution that had been asked of him. Davy made things worse by personally responding to articles critical of him in the newspapers and journals, as in his letter to the Times of 17th of October 1824, in which he provided an intemperate point-by-point rebuttal of a short paragraph that had been published describing the sea creature problem. The letter started high-handedly. We may be becoming familiar with Davy's high-handedness. Having seen my name in the Times connected with copper sheathing and patent copper, I think it right to inform you that everything relating to me in that paragraph is false. You probably will not wish statements which are erroneous, which some may think calumnious, and which may mislead the ship owners of the country to be noticed anywhere but in your own pages. I trust, therefore, that you will insert an immediate contradiction of them in your paper. Perhaps we're detecting echoes of Davy's treatment of Stevenson here. At times in the letter, Davy is distinctly petty. In his final point of rebuttal, describing a sea voyage he'd taken as part of his research, Davy writes, "It is not true that I had a pleasant voyage. I had a stormy passage out and a still more stormy passage home, and I wish the author of the paragraph in question no severer punishment for his inaccuracies and ill will if he be a landsman and liable to seasickness than a similar voyage." This was not appropriate or fitting behaviour for a president of the Royal Society, and Davy's reputation never really recovered from the ship's hulls episode. In late December 1826, Davy suffered what his brother John, an army doctor, later described as a paralytic attack affecting the right side, which had come on suddenly while Davy was at a shooting party. This was the first of several strokes that would eventually kill Davy. On the 1st of July 1827, Davy resigned the presidency of the Royal Society, having achieved little in office and having badly alienated several of his professional colleagues, one of whom was Charles Babbage, who, younger than Davy, later accused him of financial impropriety in one of his books, which was a very grave accusation. To his wife Jane, on the 30th of June 1827, Davy writes, "If I had perfectly recovered from the stroke, I know not what I should have done with respect to the presidency under the auspices of a new and more enlightened government, but my state of health renders the resignation absolutely necessary. To attempt business this year would be to prepare for another attack." Davy gave ill health as his main reason for resigning, but the stress and humiliation of the ship's hulls episode were also surely a contributing factor. Davy was not well liked as president, and he had lost the trust of many of his colleagues. Davy's final years were spent in Europe, in Austria, Slovenia, and Italy, where Davy, embittered and ill, indulged in some of his favourite long-held pastimes. They were lifelong pastimes: fishing and shooting. He travelled without Lady Davy, as their unhappy marriage had effectively broken down. He hadn't completely abandoned research, however, as this notebook shows. There we go. Davy was conducting experiments on the torpedo fish, trying to understand the nature of the electric shocks it's capable of generating. That is a thread that runs throughout Davy's career, his interest in electricity, so-called animal electricity. It wasn't understood whether the type of electricity creatures such as the torpedo were able to generate was the same kind of electricity that the pile produced. So it was all very, it was up for grabs, and Davy was engaged in that debate throughout his life. Being relieved from office also gave Davy the time to write. He worked steadily on Salmonia, a love letter to fish and fishing in the mould of Isaac Walton and Charles Cotton's The Complete Angler, and Consolations in Travel, a philosophical dialogue in which a series of hypotheses are debated by gentlemen who work out their philosophical positions on a range of matters through conversation. Davy, it seems, knew he was dying. In Consolations, published posthumously, he attempts to pull together the various threads of his past life, touching on the nature of the soul, the formation of the earth, theoretical chemistry, and more. Davy suffered a second stroke on the 20th of February 1829 and wrote in distress to his brother John, who came to Rome to tend to him. The last letter Davy sent to England to his sister Kitty on the 20th of April 1829 is poignantly affectionate and written in an unsteady hand. "My dear sister, I am very ill, but thanks to my dearest John, still alive. God bless you all, H. Davy. Davy died with John and Jane, his wife, in the adjoining rooms of an inn in Geneva in the early hours of the 29th of May, 1829. He was only 50 years old. Today, I hope to have shed some light on the complex aspects of Davy's character. He was ambitious, reckless, impulsive, brilliant, arrogant, fallible. I also hope to have shown that there's more to Davy than the lamp, and he isn't easily pigeonholed. He was a chemist, but also a poet, an inventor, a philosopher, a natural historian, a writer, a lecturer, an administrator. To attempt to place Davy in one of the two camps, art or science, is to do him a disservice either way. And excitingly, we're continuing to find out more about the chameleon Davy all the time. I'll close now with a shameless plug for the current project I'm working on, the Davy Notebooks project. We are currently transcribing, with the help of an almost 3,000 strong online volunteer community, the 75 manuscript notebooks of Davy, most of which have never been transcribed before. So far, we've transcribed around 3/4 of the notebooks. There is still work to be done, however. Some of the findings I've presented to you today have come directly out of the Davy Notebooks project, and that work has been done by volunteers all over the world. They've helped us to uncover these new findings. You too might want to volunteer and help us to continue to add colour and detail to what we know of the life, career, and works of one of the most fascinating figures in early 19th century culture. If you'd like to find out a little more about the Davy Notebooks project, please visit our website. The link is at the top there, and I will also pop that into the chat. Thank you for listening, and I will end there, just a little over time. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much, Andrew. You certainly have shone a very bright light on the man and his work. I knew very little about Davy until this talk, and you've certainly given us a lot of info there to give a very detailed background of the man and his work. It's great. I couldn't help observing at the beginning when you were talking about his inhalation experiments, particularly with nitrous oxide. It's quite evident that we've gone full circle, isn't it? Because I see everywhere evidence that youth today, let's call them enthusiastic inhalers, are doing their own scientific experiments, aren't they, with the gas? So finding out the same things. Anyway, let's move on. We have one or two comments in the chat box. Joe Cork says Davy had strict rules for others. Notebook 07 that he clearly didn't believe applied to his younger self. Comment or not?
Yes, I think we have to remember that Davy was he was probably the first salaried professional experimentalist. You know, that the foundation of the Royal Institution, it was a kind of a new venture, and he was paid to conduct experiments, which was very unusual at the time. It tended to be a kind of gentlemanly pursuit. If you could afford your own personal laboratory, you'd go off and do that. So I think Davy kind of he created that role. He created those expectations. I think that's absolutely right that he didn't believe those rules applied to his younger self, but he very quickly became quite authoritarian, and he very much viewed the Royal Institution laboratory as his laboratory. We know that the lab notebooks, although they were the property and remain the property of the Royal Institution, Davy treated them very much as his own property. There's one entry in which we know he took the notebook up to bed with him. It's not supposed to leave the lab. And after Davy's death, they had to be recovered from Davy's personal items. So
Yeah. I wondered if Davy's experiments with inhalation did actually affect his physical brain in later life, and that was a potential cause of his character change and later on his strokes. Do you think?
it's always difficult to kind of retrospectively diagnose. I would say that the quantities that Davy was inhaling were obscene. Building the breathing box and breathing very pure gas, gas synthesized by those who really have perfected the means of making it. That can't have done him any good. Davy only had one brother, John, a younger brother. John lived well into, I think he was in his 70s or 80s. We can only speculate, but it surely can't have done Davy any good.
Yeah. Okay. Let's open up to questions. If you wish to speak, then please unmute. Otherwise, stay muted. But you should find you're able to unmute now. I lost you, Barry, for a moment, but are you still there with us?
Yes, we had a flash of lightning and thunder here, and everything went down for about 2 minutes, but I got back in.
Okay, I've made you co-host again. I noticed that you weren't, so that was the problem, that you couldn't unmute. Anyway,
Steve, can I just pick up on a question that you just asked about whether or not the inhaling nitrous oxide had any effect on yourself? I was just wondering to ask Andrew, is there any evidence from the notebooks that he actually did do any more experiments, sort of self-experiments later on?
Yeah, Davy was. I'll just talk a little about the nitrous oxide stuff first, and then I'll say a bit more about other self-experimentation. So Davy was keen to combine nitrous oxide with other substances. So I said he experimented a little on what he called hydrocarbonate, which we now know as carbon monoxide, which obviously had very ill effects. We know in the notebooks that from the notebooks that Davy drank a whole bottle of wine in under a minute, then inhaled a huge quantity of nitrous oxide, and there's a great comment. He writes in kind of a shaky hand, "Very sick." So it made him very ill. He writes to his brother John in, I think it's around 1808, 1809, cautioning John against doing experiments on himself with digitalis. So again, this is an example of Davy's rules not applying to himself, but he strongly suggested to John that he shouldn't become known for doing things like that. And it was around 1812, 1813, Davy was experimenting on nitrogen trichloride, very explosive substance, and he was there with Faraday. They were working on a tiny quantities, kind of a grain of rice size, and they were all swaddled in their protective gear, and they were blown up. It was risky being around Davy in the lab. He really didn't have much regard for his own personal safety, and I think on one occasion he couldn't see. He had small fragments of glass in his eye from one of these explosions. There is also an earlier instance of Davy, 1807, going into Newgate prison to investigate the cause of what we now know as jail fever, and he became very ill as a result. So he put himself on the line there, and the Royal Institution would pin a note to the outside giving regular updates on Davy's health. Such was his celebrity and the concern from at that time, and he very nearly died on that occasion.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Okay. Something's happened to my sound here. Mike, you've been waiting patiently. Mike Hollingsworth, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. Excellent talk. Thank you very much indeed. Two questions, if I can. You seem to have a wealth of letters that have been kept. Was that the norm in that period of time, or have we just been very lucky that everything or a lot of things that Davy wrote has been kept? And secondly, completely different, because of his character, what was his relationship with this other very eminent scientist, Michael Faraday? How did they get on?
Okay. We have around 1,300 letters written by Davy and those in his circle. Since we published the edition in 2020, we found a few more. This always happens, but we'll publish those as well. Manuscript materials were not valued, contemporaneously as they are now. We have none of Davy's incoming correspondence, or very little of it. So Davy did not keep letters sent to him as a rule. And I mean, one of the main reasons that we have access to this cache of Davy letters was John Davy, Humphrey's brother, was he was a biographer. He wrote Davy's biography, and he was very keen to kind of cement Davy's reputation after all of the controversy that happened later in life. So he treated the letters well and kept them, and they eventually came down through the family to the Royal Institution. So and other places. So we're lucky in that respect. In terms of Davy's relationship with Faraday, Davy and Faraday first came into contact in 1812. Faraday had attended Davy's Royal Institution lectures and actually presented Davy with a manuscript volume of the lectures. So Faraday was in the audience there, writing it down, and this impressed Davy. They went on a European tour together around between 1813 and 1815, and Faraday basically served as Davy's valet during the time. There wasn't really kind of an inkling at that point of the conflict that would come to characterize their later relationship. In the early 1820s, Faraday was working as Davy's assistant, and Davy effectively blocked Faraday's election to fellowship of the Royal Society. So his mentor blackballed him, if you like. And this all it came down to an accusation. It was all very shady, but the accusation was that Faraday had not properly credited Davy or William Hyde Wollaston, another prominent man of science, in publishing a paper on electromagnetic rotation. So, I mean, Davy, as we know from the letters and the notebooks to a degree, if you crossed him, he was in such a position of authority that it could cause real problems. And Davy gave Faraday, quite time-consuming and pointless tasks to do in the early 1820s, just to keep him busy and to kind of hold him at bay a little bit. But of course, with Davy out of the picture, Faraday he progressed quite rapidly.
Mm. Okay, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Andrew. One question here from Peter Weston. Did he have any children? You didn't speak of children.
No, he didn't. I've spoke a little bit today about David Knight, Davy's most recent and best biographer. David writes that, you know, Davy being knighted and then being made a baronet, it was kind of an empty gesture, really, because he didn't have any children to pass the title on to. John Davy, his brother, had a large family. Davy didn't. I suspect he was. He first of all, he enjoyed the freedom of going from Cornwall to London, and he was, it's fair to say, a bit of a lad back then. In later life, I imagine science was took up most of his time, and we have a comment from Jane Davy, who was Humphry's wife, around the time of the safety lamp research, where she says something along the lines of the mines are Davy's wife at the moment. So I think that gives an insight into the kind of intensity of his scientific research, and perhaps family wasn't a priority for him.
Okay.
Did he have many lovers, do you think? Did he have many lovers or not?
We know that he in his early years, so around the time of attending working at the Medical Pneumatic Institution, we strongly suspect that he had an affair with Anna Beddoes, who was Thomas Beddoes, his boss. It was his wife, and we found love poetry in the notebooks, shared between them, and Anna indeed writes in some of Davy's notebooks. So I think early on in life he put himself about a bit. Not sure about later in life. I mean, I said that the marriage between Jane and Humphry was an unhappy one. They were effectively living apart in the last few years of Davy's life. When he was in Slovenia, he developed a really quite strange fascination with an innkeeper's daughter, Josephine de Tella. He suggested that it was entirely innocent, and she was more his muse than anything else. But I think that merits further investigation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Joe, would you like to unmute? Good to see you this morning.
Yeah. Yes, I was just wondering, thank you for the talk, Andrew. At the beginning, you said, I believe, you said it would be odd for people, for Davy not to be recognised. People would have thought it was odd that he was not recognised in the same way, and his anniversary went fairly much unmarked. And we've heard from you about what other men of science, because there weren't any women, I suppose, other men of science thought of him and how he really lost it a bit at the end. But what was the public perception by the time he died? Had the public given up knowing? Had the rest of all the people who had flocked to him in early years, had they all given up on him? Yeah, that's my question.
That's a very good question. I think Davy, I mean, his golden decade, if you like, his really brilliant period was the first decade, so 1800 to 1810. The safety lamp work really secured his reputation as a national celebrity. He was celebrated for this. The letters that I was reading out, containing the nasty comments on Stevenson and that sort of thing, they were not known to the public. So his reputation did take hits. I mean, the Royal Navy copper sheathing incident did affect his reputation slightly. Also, the the publication of the first biography of Davy in 1831 by John Ayton Paris, who was a Cornish doctor. John and Humphry was dead by this point. John was very unhappy about that. He thought that it really kind of besmirched his brother's legacy, which was part of the reason why John himself set out to write a corrective to that a few years later. I mean, I think in the 20th century, it's more that Davy has just slipped spectacularly from view. I mean, when I give talks and just discuss Davy with people, some people have no idea who he is. Those who do would discuss or mention the safety lamp. The decline in his reputation and fortune since the Victorian age is marked. And of course, then we had Darwin, and it kind of swept Davy away a bit. I mean, it was the 19th century was such an age of invention and discovery that he has lots of competition there. But for the first few decades, he was effectively a superstar, and that's really not the case at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Robert.
Right. Well, I'll just come in here with a point that it seems that some of the great men of science will fall out with somebody, and they'll do everything in their power to totally destroy that person. We can look at Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke. I think Newton got to be president of the society, and I think he threw Hooke out, and he had all of his papers removed and so on and so on. It might have been that, that Davy's problem with Faraday was repaired by somebody else falling out with Davy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of that tension on the one hand. You're out to make discoveries and to do the right thing, to add to knowledge, and on the other hand, there's all the wrangling of office and privilege and that sort of thing. And I mean, Davy was very, very thin-skinned, always very kind of conscious of his humble origins, and there are some spectacular letters during the safety lamp business where he's writing to members of the aristocracy, and they're writing back to him just saying this is not the conduct of a gentleman. I can't quite believe that I'm writing to Sir Humphry Davy here. So yeah, I mean, there's always that tension, I think. And as I say, Davy did not respond well to criticism, even when it was justified.
Possibly Newton didn't either.
Thank you, Robert. Barry, any comments before we've got to cut and run fairly soon, I think?
Well, just to say thanks so much to Andrew for such a fascinating insight, and even those of us who think we know a little bit about Davy have learned an awful lot today. I certainly have. I'm just wondering, Andrew, when you finished the Davy project, have you got it in your mind to tackle any other of the great men of science?
Well, I'm fully engaged with Davy at the moment, but there are other allied projects ongoing. My colleague Tim Fulford, who was one of the co-editors of Davy's letters, is currently editing Thomas Beddoes, his correspondence. So that will be great when that comes out. I suspect that will reveal lots of new and interesting information on Davy's early life. We might even find out what happened between Davy and Anna. I don't know, but yeah, there's plenty going on. I think Davy will be occupying me for the foreseeable future, but we shall see, and I will let you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, please keep in touch, and I certainly hope that some people watching today will take an interest in helping you out with the project. Andrew has kindly put the web link in the chat box, so if you're interested, I suggest you make a note of it, or even save the chat while we're still online. You can do that by clicking on the three dots at the bottom, where it's just above where it says to, and on the right hand side click three dots and it comes up and says more, and you should be able to save the chat, and that will save it in a plain text file on your computer, probably in a Zoom folder. Okay, well, with that, I echo Barry's thanks, and on behalf of everybody here today, Andrew, you've certainly started off our year wonderfully with a brilliant expose, I think, of Humphry Davy, his work, and the man himself. What a brilliant insight it's been. So thank you once again, and please, everybody, give Andrew a big round of applause.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's been great. Thank you.